Welcome back to Law and Crime, everybody. We are live right now in that case that I was talking about before our break, the Timothy Coggins case, this 35-year-old cold case that is now on trial. Mr. Coggins was a young 23-year-old man who was living in Georgia when he was brutally attacked and killed. His body was left in a field back in 1983. He was a young black man, and it is alleged that several white individuals, killed him because they were racially motivated. This was a racially motivated killing. This case that we're covering right now, this trial, is the trial of Frank Gebhardt. He is one of the people that has been implicated in the killing of Timothy Coggins. On the stand right now is Larry Peterson. I believe he is a crime scene technician going into what was discovered. We'll jump into that testimony in a minute. But before we do, as we talk about Georgia, I have a very special guest joining me right now on set, not in via Skype, forensic death investigator from Jacksonville State University, Joseph Scott Morgan. Joseph, it's great to have you here on the program. Finally, good to have you here.
Great to be here with you.
35-year-old cold case. What do you make of that?
Just the thought of it is overwhelming from a physical evidence standpoint. How much evidence has been lost over all this time? How much stuff that they did retain, how much of it is degraded as far as DNA? And who's been touching the evidence? And I don't mean that in a nefarious way. Stuff gets shifted around. If you go into some of these evidence rooms over the years, you have stuff stacked to the ceiling. And you're talking about a 35-year-old cold case. And now people have an expectation that we're going to come up with molecular evidence at this point down the road, this many, many years down the road. People's memories fade. All sorts of little nuances come into play here, so this is going to be quite a compelling case.
We've already seen some explanation about how so much evidence has been lost, which is such a tragedy. But here's what we're going to do. We are going to jump live into that courtroom right now, and then Joseph and I will be back because there is a lot to discuss in this case. Crime, everybody. So what you see right there is evidence in itself. That is the leader, Larry Peterson, the crime scene analyst, who collected or was able to process later on at probably a later date some of the evidence at this crime scene. Again, I'm here with Joseph Scott Morgan. What do you think about evidence collected from the crime scene? Again, we're talking about a 35-year-old murder case, and as we said earlier, so much of the evidence is missing. On top of the fact that techniques used back then were very different than today, right?
Yeah, they were, and you know, I've told tales over the years about, I remember when I first came in the field, which would have been at about this point in time, all those many years ago, you know, you still had people that would show up at the scene, and, you know, the detectives would have cigarettes hanging out of their mouth, you know, working the case.
No, they weren't.
Oh, yeah, yeah. And so there was not, I'm not saying that they weren't passionate about what they were doing and they didn't want the truth. I'm just saying that there is a different level that we've jumped up to relative to care and knowledge and that sort of thing. Looking at this, Jesse, and you can see all of that, all those items stacked on the table. It's they're presenting a picture to the jury here already, you know, of what we have. You know, it's been talked about now, and I don't know how much the jury is aware of it, but you know that you know, stuff has been lost. Well, obviously they do have some things. I expect to see quite a bit of physical evidence relative to things. I think that they've done plaster cast of tires, this sort of thing. They had soil evidence that was involved, and there's some blood evidence as well. And that's going to be quite compelling to see. And kind of stepping back through time, she's holding up a garment there. It looks like a pair of pants that have been cut away at some point in time. So it's going to be quite compelling to see some of this stuff as it's on display. And Peterson goes into his descriptor about this on the stand.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible to see anything from a crime scene, let alone 35 years ago.
Yeah.
I want to just confirm if we have audio, if the attorney, she's just showing them to the jury right there. But, you know, I got to say, 35 years, that is such an area to examine and say, well, how can you preserve something from this for such a long period of time?
And you know, Dan was just in here talking about his latest work, and from a historical standpoint, you look at this and you're literally opening the vault. You're opening the door, going back in time with this physical evidence. You don't have a lot of cases like this where you have, they've talked about how they've lost some, but you know, just there we saw clothing that's being brought out. It looked like it's stained with something. I don't know what it is at this point in time. Pretty incredible stuff.
Pretty incredible stuff is right. Let's go back live into the courtroom. Larry Peterson, the crime scene analyst, is speaking. We're watching the defense cross-examine this witness, Larry Peterson, a crime scene analyst in the Timothy Coggins case out of Georgia, trying to understand what to make of it. Again, I'm here with Joseph Scott Morgan. So, Joseph, what do you make of this testimony?
Well, he's having to kind of peel the onion here, and he's being very, very careful. He's covering a lot of territory, though, Jesse. I'm really surprised at this point that he hasn't attempted to exploit specific things like transfer of evidence relative to that sheet that we saw. We don't know the, if you will, for lack of a better term, provenance of it, what its point of origin is. How many police officers were at the scene, for instance, that were Caucasoid, that may or may not have left their own
Caucasian.
hair? Yeah, Caucasian, that had left their hairs behind. So, and he talks about how hair does fall off. He's very accurate in that. And it's, techniques have completely changed at this point in time. They've kind of evolved over the years where there's much more care taken. One of the things that I'm interested in understanding is that the crime scene analyst is talking about retrieving the hairs at the scene in this big open field. People at home, they think that this type of science is what we refer to as quantitative science, where you can put numbers to it. It's not. It's more qualitative and the opinion of the witness that's being questioned.
What is the defense trying to do here? Saying that this evidence was tainted in some way, that it's not reliable, that it really doesn't tell anything about who committed this crime? What are we trying to understand here?
Yeah, what they're trying to state here is that they're talking about there's nothing nefarious going on. They're just talking about cross-contamination where things will just simply fall away or come in contact with the body, or in certain cases with the suspect. And in this particular case, they're wondering about the origins of these hairs and also this blood evidence he was just referring to on the dollar bill.
Well, let's listen back in and we can learn a little bit more from this witness and the evidence in this case. Look like there's a little break right there. Now, you see that man in the white shirt? His head is being blocked by that other gentleman. That is the defendant. There you go. Frank Gebhardt. That is the defendant right there. He has been accused of killing Timothy Coggins back in 1983 in Georgia. And we're trying to understand, was this man ultimately responsible for the brutal slaying of this young boy? Well, let's talk a little bit more about it with Joseph Scott Morgan. Joseph, you are from Georgia. Can you explain a little bit more the territory there of where this body was found?
Yeah. This is roughly 35 miles due south of Atlanta. It's now considered well within the parameters of the Atlanta metro area, but back then it was very rural. The case actually took place in a location called Sunnyside, Georgia. For NASCAR fans, it's right near the NASCAR track, not too far away there in Georgia. It was isolated, very rural, the kind of place that an individual would not have been heard, if you will, in the midst of this horrible crime.
Yeah, I mean, so in other words, a great place to kill someone and leave a body and drag them.
Yeah. There's a lot of kind of farmland there, densely wooded pines, this sort of thing. So back during that period of time, I'm not going to say it was completely isolated, but it was not a place that would have been trafficked very much, if you will, except by locals.
Unbelievable. Really sad case of this young 23-year-old man who was killed senselessly. Brutal slaying, and we're trying to understand 35 years later who did this. We'll take a quick break. We'll be right back. Thank you, as always, Anthony. You can go to lawandcrime.com to learn a little bit more about those stories and the other top legal, crime, and entertainment stories and political stories there on Law and Crime of the day. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about that case, about that graphic novelist, because it is extremely disturbing and unsettling. So let me bring back in Joseph Scott Morgan, forensic death investigator from Jacksonville State University. Wow, what a bizarre case. And I know we were just talking about it. You've been following this one. What do you think about it?
Yeah, I have. That this miserable circumstance took place in this tiny apartment. He's indwelling in this place with this poor woman's body. And to make matters worse, there was a small child in there the entire time. This person, he obviously had these fantastic ideas you know, living out these horrible fantasies that he's rendering forth in graphic novels, draining the blood out of this woman's body.
Yeah,
and that was one of the big keys. How do you physically do that?
Well, how does someone physically do that?
Yeah. And one of the things I talked about this a couple of years ago. We were all kind of struggling with this and trying to understand, because it was, I don't want to be too over the top here, but it was almost like field dressing an animal after you've killed them, and where you have to be dependent upon gravity to draw the blood out. Oof. So one of the ideas here was that she had to be in some kind of position so that the blood could in fact drain out of her body.
And she was alive for all of this?
Yeah, for part of the time, yeah. There were focal areas of hemorrhage in her body and this sort of thing. It was a horrible, torturous case.
How does this even, like, how does this even happen? Like, what is the, when you look at the crime and what happened to her, what does that tell you about the man who did this?
I don't know.
What is he going after here?
I don't know. Certainly, it just reeks of utter depravity on many levels. I think that some of us people, we can't even fathom these things, but these things do in fact happen. It's the stuff of nightmares. I have no idea, and I wouldn't. I'm not a psychologist, so I wouldn't want to go down that road, but I have to, it was truly where his art was influencing his reality. So it would really draw into question. I just can't believe that this small child was not actually directly harmed in that.
Thank goodness.
Yeah,
Thank goodness.
Yeah.
How do you process a crime scene like that? How do you process a body like that?
Methodically. It's one of these things where if you do not cover every jot and tittle along the way, you're going to wind up finding yourself in a whole heap of trouble. I have in the past. You come in and the place is just absolutely wrecked with physical destruction of property, potentially if there was a struggle. And then you've got multiple areas of contact throughout the scene where the blood evidence has been left behind. And those things have to be considered, particularly if there's an attempt to clean up and all these sorts of things. There's so many things you can't see with the unaided eye. And just the movement, because it's this kind of dance of horror that takes place in this environment, and you're kind of going back to interpret this thing. It's not like someone just walks in and simply shoots somebody and then extricates himself from the scene. It's not like that, Jesse. This guy indwelled this place with this woman for a protracted period of time. Police had to force their way in. So it's multi-layered, highly complex, and they did a fantastic job. The one thing about it, it's contained. It was contained within this apartment, so that helps you as opposed to being kind of broad strokes all over the place.
What a horrific case. Well, he faces life in prison for that horrific crime. You can go to lawandcrime.com to learn a little bit more about that one. But we're going to switch gears right now. I want to talk more about the main case that we're covering today, our main trial out of Georgia. And this is the case of Timothy Coggins, who was brutally killed back in 1983. He was a 23-year-old African-American man who was going out one night when, by certain accounts, he was approached by a large white man in a club, and that was the last time anyone ever saw him alive. His body was found stabbed, multiple stab and incision wounds and drag marks out in a field. And now, today, 35 years later, multiple people have been implicated in this crime, including Frank Gebhardt. That is the man that we are covering today. That is his trial. That is the first person who is on trial for the murder of Timothy Coggins. We have a short report about this case that can help explain a little bit more about it. Let's play that for you right now. Thank you as always, Anthony. That is the case that we are covering here on Law and Crime. What a really remarkable case 35 years later, and that is what we are covering. As we wait for the live feed, the court was in a quick recess. I want to bring back in Joseph Scott Morgan to ask you a question about the brutality of the victim, Timothy Coggins. Multiple stab wounds, incision wounds. What does that tell you about who committed this crime?
Well, I don't know. I can tell you what it tells me about the nature of the crime. I think the only thing I can think of is torturous. This is a torturous event that took place over a period of time. You're talking about stab wounds, which the knife is being inserted to the body. And what's really fascinating about this, Jesse, is they talk about these incised wounds. That means that the blade was drug across the surface of the skin. Oof. And these superficial but very painful, the old adage, death by a thousand cuts. and then he is apparently drugged. They've used the term logging chain. I don't know where they get that from, but he was tied to the back of a truck and apparently drug about. And so you're going to have all of these other little almost dicing-like injuries where he's being drugged over this gravel surface. Painful, painful way to die. No way that anyone should die like this. A horrible, horrible thing.
Oh, just really horrific when you hear about the details of what he suffered that night. Unbelievable. We're continuing to cover this case. We have a new witness on the stand, Rachel Thornton. Let's go live into the courtroom right now. Okay, so that's Rachel Thornton from the GBI Crime Lab, but she is a serologist. Before you go to your Wikipedia or dictionary, let's learn a little bit about what that means with Joseph Scott Morgan. So what is a serologist? What's going on here?
Yeah, a serologist, as she explained, studies bodily fluids. That's everything from saliva, semen, blood, obviously, even fecal matter. And what they're doing is they're looking for ways of typing. They're looking to type blood. And keep in mind, Jesse, we've been talking a little bit about history today. Back during the time when this case actually happened, they didn't have DNA specialists. The serologist is the person that would actually go in and physically type the blood. You know,
when you say type, what do you mean?
Well, you know, we have all of our various typing groups, our A, B,
right.
our,
okay.
you know, our O, all those sorts of things. And so we've got these various groups. And so that was the way back years ago that we would narrow the field, if you will. And we would talk about 1 in several thousand. Now you're talking about quintillions now,
sure.
you know, relative to DNA. So it's changed. And interestingly enough, a lot of the people that have once been in serology have now crossed over into DNA at this point in time. They're still using this term to apply to her, though. And historically, it's very important because that's who would have initially done the typing.
And that's what this case is about, history, because it happened in 1983. A lot of the methods are different than they are today. So what do you expect to learn from such a witness?
Well, she's going to talk about the nature of the evidence, probably how it's collected. She's going to be a bit more specific and targeted as opposed to the previous witness. She's going to talk about her particular area and how they go about typing blood and recovering blood evidence at scenes, and also the evidence that is brought into her to be processed. She would not traditionally have gone out to the scene. She would be in the lab, as we refer to, a bench forensic scientist. They're sitting there on the bench and they're processing all the stuff in their laboratory.
Talk about blood. We saw it earlier, this sheet. There was so much blood on it. This guy was brutalized, Joseph.
Yeah, it really is. And I think the compelling thing about that sheet, Jesse, is that, and there they go. They're pulling it out there, apparently. One of the things about this is that it really brings it home to the jury. Can you imagine seeing that being brought out before you, these stains from so many years ago?
That's what it is, stains from 35 years ago.
I know. And listen, a lot of people at home, they sit back and they hear the X's and O's, and you start talking about these things in very abstract terms, scientific terms. But when you can put this before a jury and they see this thing coming back through time, it's quite amazing. It's very compelling. Extremely compelling.
Can you test blood that old?
You can. A lot of it is going to be dependent upon how well it's been stored. Let me give you a brief example. If just reduce it to everyday home items. Let's say we have a gallon of milk, okay? If we don't take care of that milk, it has a very short shelf life, right? And so it will spoil, and it's a biological sample. So if it is not treated correctly, it will degrade. It will degrade if it's been kept in, say, an evidence locker, not in a controlled circumstance where you have, environmental conditions like elevated humidity, heat, all these sorts of things. It's very, very fragile. So yeah, it can be.
All right, Joseph, that was a really good lesson right there on how this all works. I love having you on. So let's talk a little bit more. Let's jump into the live feed into the courtroom. All right, that's the conclusion for that witness. But what did we learn? Let's bring back in Joseph Scott Morgan from Jacksonville State University. What is going on? What did you learn from that witness?
Yeah, first off, it was rather swift, wasn't it? Both sides got her on and got her off the stand pretty quickly there. They were talking about the false positives. Let me kind of illustrate this for you. These presumptive blood tests that they do at scenes, that serologists would do and do in the library, in the laboratory, is this idea of we have to determine first if if the stain is blood, and then if it's human versus animal, and then they'll type it after that. They were talking about the two tests, the presumptive tests that were running on the rock, Jesse, and one of the things that's at issue here is this, the rock itself. It might contain things like grass, moss, different things in the soil, biological elements that are going to also interact with the test and give you a false positive. So it'll be inconclusive. Why this is important is that the rock was immediately adjacent to the body. It was there. There was a blood stain, or what they believed was a blood stain on it. They felt like that was, for their purposes, important to collect, and it was, to bring it in. And this again goes back to connectivity between the rock and the body, and placing the body there, and physical contact. Was the rock, did they, they didn't know at the time, was the rock actually used as a method of attack? So it's very compelling, and she obviously established that that the blood was in fact his.
Now, Joseph, I know our time together has come to an end.
Wow.
I know, it went really quick.
Yeah.
I know I have to sign you off, but final thoughts as we look at this 35-year-old cold case. Your perspective has been amazing today, and I love having you on set, so I would like you to be here more, but what's your final thoughts on this case? Well,
I think historically, I think looking back at this, it really paints a picture as how far we've come in forensics, the care that we take. There's a lot of questions about forensics right now, but they have done a reasonable job at this point. I'm amazed that, when I first came into this, I was thinking, well, we're not going to have a lot of evidence. They've talked about losing evidence. It appears that they have got quite a bit of evidence in this particular case, and the fact that they've kept up with it, kept it stored, I think the question would be the level of quality, and is it acceptable? Remember, we're trying this case in present terms, not in 1983 terms. Is it acceptable now? Okay, does it meet the standard now? And that's the big question here. That is the big question for both sides and the jury, and we'll have to see. Joseph Scott Morgan, thank you so much. It was great having you here. Safe trip back home. Yeah, you bet. Thank you for having me. Of course. All right, everybody, we're going to jump back into the courtroom, and Ashley Hinkle, the GBI Crime Lab forensic biologist, is on the stand right now. Let's go.